Okay, this video is entitled In Defense of the Question, Prove There Isn't a God. But before I get into that, because I understand that that's going to be something that is already raising the hackles on the necks of atheists, because the question, at least ostensibly, is irrational. You can't prove what is not. You can't prove a negative, as Ayn Rand says. You can't prove that something is not, because not denotes the infinite absence of a thing. And if something is infinitely absent, then its existence is irrelevant. Therefore, attempting to prove its non-existence, let me say its existence is irrelevant, which makes non-existence its ipso facto state, which basically makes the thing a blank. So in saying prove something is not is irrational, because you can't prove that nothing exists. So I understand that. I'm going to approach it a little bit differently, but first, in a sense that I sort of understand what theists, I'm not going to say Christians because it can be anybody who believes in God, we'll even include agnostics in this. I think that's appropriate. Someone who agnostics, deists, someone who concedes that there is a divine agent who interacts with creation and is in some manner indispensable to the machinations of the universe and its rote existence. But the problem I have noticed, I think, and let me get this out of the way because this is an important point to make. The problem with both atheists, anti-theists, and theists is not in proving God for the theist side or disproving God for the atheist or anti-theist side, but it is defining God, meaning defining God in a way that is rationally conducive with the stated, presumed, and submitted belief system. Theists, in my experience, and I was basically a Calvinist Christian, neo-Calvinist movement, which is essentially a return to Reformation Protestantism, true blue, dyed-in-the-wool Calvinism and Lutheranism, Lutheranism, and of course that is a product of Augustinian metaphysics. So I speak with some experience on this, at least from the Christian point of view, is that the definition of God is not rational. The definition of an all-controlling, all-sovereign, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent being is simply not a rational definition. And therefore, to try to incorporate that definition of God into an existential philosophy or existential strictures can't be done. An atheist suffers from the same problem. Is atheists don't have a rational definition for God, so they say God doesn't exist, but they don't explain what that definition of God is. They are more than happy and usually very comfortable in assuming the definition, the irrational definition of God set forth by the theists and the religious and those people who they contend with. Now, the atheists get a little bit of a pass on this because I understand for an atheist, or a little bit, actually it's a little bit more rational for an anti-theist, one who, the idea that God is not irrelevant, the idea that one doesn't need to define God because God is irrelevant in forming an existential ideology or philosophy that's rationally consistent, that proceeds consistently from presumption to conclusion. Therefore, the onus really isn't on them to define God because they don't view God as having any relevance. Even if they could define God, there would be no point because God is immaterial. God isn't true not so much because Christians are wrong or Muslims are wrong, but God isn't true because they haven't figured out a way to incorporate such a being into their existential philosophy. And of course, they concede that their existential philosophy is rational. And so I give them a little bit of a pass on that. But still, I think that if you are going to say, I don't believe in God, and here's why I don't think he exists, the minute you concede to a something, even the concept of something, you need to have a definition. Otherwise, you need to merely say, I am opposed to religion, not necessarily the idea of God. I'm opposed to religion and the dogmas of religion, and I'm opposed to their definitions of God as irrational based on the doctrines and the theologies and the religious philosophies they teach. Not so much based on the idea that God in and of himself, removed from religion, is somehow irrational or false, because of course that would take a definition. So I think atheists need to be a little bit more specific in order to be rationally consistent. They need to be a little bit more consistent in saying either this is how we define God, separate from religion, and we don't think God is real because his characteristics as we define them are false or incompatible or whatever, or they should really stick to sort of anti-religious declarations and anti-religious movements saying we deny your doctrine and we deny your definitions of God as irrational. We don't have one because we don't find one necessary. And I know it's a little bit of semantics. And I can see that I may not be completely right on this point in a sense that atheists must have a definition of God. I don't think they do. I think they need to be a little bit more clear in saying that we don't have a definition of God because we don't think God is relevant. Even if we had a definition, it would be piffle, it would be trifle, it would be tertiary, ancillary, irrelevant is a better word. It would be ethereal nothingness. So there's no reason to dwell on the irrelevance. Now, that, of course, is a problem because what that really says is if you say, we don't believe in God because we don't think God is relevant, well, then you're on the hook for, okay, not disproving God, but rather you're on the hook for, because you know there's no sense in disproving something you don't concede can't exist. If you don't concede it can't exist, then there's no definition for it. If you don't have a definition for it, then you can't disprove it because you don't know what it is. You're disproving. So rather, atheists are on the hook for explaining just how, and they should spend a lot more time doing this and a little less time assaulting religion. You could just say, I deny the assumptions, the conclusions, the doctrines, the strictures of religion, and then move on to why your existential worldview is much more compatible with reason and truth and morality and reality. I find that that's not done a lot, although it is done some, but I think that needs to be the primary thrust. You want to offer people an alternative perspective that answers the question, what is man and what should man then do? So atheists are on the hook for explaining just how their worldview is rationally consistent from assumption to presumption. That's a lot harder to do, which is why I think a lot of atheists are pseudo-intellectual. In a sense, I don't mean that pejoratively, I mean in a sense that they understand there's something fundamentally wrong with religion, and so instead of assaulting the doctrines of religion and attempting to produce one of their own that's more consistent, they spend a lot of time calling theists and religious people crazy or insane or stupid or blind, and rail a lot against the religion and the what I think are quite obvious contradictions in terms and irrational conclusions of the doctrines. It's not difficult to, it doesn't take an intellectual stalwart to assault irrational doctrines of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. You know, for me, the inconsistencies are obvious. Now, I was a Christian Calvinist. I'm still a Christian, but I no longer approach my Christianity from a specific orthodox point of view, because the Bible is not a philosophy, and religion is not a full-on philosophy. One has to broach religion with a philosophy, or at least an axiomatic, irreducible, metaphysical, and epistemological primary before conceding a religion. If you have that, then the religion either fits into those rational axioms or not. I feel that Christianity does, in fact, but that's not the point of this video. But at any rate, so what I was saying was that atheists need to spend a lot more time explaining the rational consistency of their ideas and not spend so much time. Oh, what I was saying was it doesn't take an intellectual stalwart or someone with a PhD in theology to point out the contradictions in the terms. And again, that looks a little bit conceited coming from me because I was a Calvinist. Yes, I concluded that paradox was fine. I concluded that contradiction was a fine way to interpret reality. That is, of course, madness, and I realized that later. But it's really no different than, you know, your common atheist or your run-of-the-mill scientist who concedes paradox in the universe. The idea that space and time are somehow finite, and yet they are, I should say the other way around. The idea that space and time are in fact infinite and can never be proven to be finite, and yet they are considered and they are quantified as finite, is paradoxical. Of course, the common trope, the particle wave duality of light, is a common paradox. Dark matter would be another paradox, since dark matter can't by definition be observed directly, at least not so far as I know. To say that it exists would be paradoxical. You can only observe dark matter by the actions, by the secondary actions of objects around it. Gravity would be the same way. There's no particle of gravity that's been discovered, but gravity is considered to exist, even though gravity, like space and time, is not observable, absent the movement of the objects secondary to it. And like I said, same thing with space and time. So, you know, your run-of-the-mill empiricist atheist also functions from the idea that paradox is completely fine and consistent in their worldview and in explaining reality. So I don't beat myself up too bad about being a Calvinist and conceding the contradictions as being just completely fine and self-evident aspects of my faith back then. Of course, now I completely deny that. I deny paradox in any way is a legitimate means for explaining truth, reality, because paradox by definition is a question mark. It's an infinite question. In the sense that paradox is a contradiction, not necessarily two different ways of examining a singular object which has a definition. It is more like the paradox where gravity can't be observed to exist, but we concede it does exist. There is no gravity that's being examined from two different ways. There is no central unit or object in question that's being examined. There is merely two mutually exclusive ideas that are said, that are assumed to be somehow compatible beyond an explanation. The non-observance of gravity, the non-empirical observance of gravity with its existence, which is funny because what you've just done, at least superficially, is injected reason as the argument for gravity, not empirical evidence, which is funny because scientists make a big deal, and atheists as well make a big deal about the absolute necessity of empirical evidence in formulating truth. I'm not an empiricist, if you have guessed in the least. I completely deny empiricism is the means for truth. In fact, evidence is, there is no such thing as observable evidence without reason. Observable evidence without reason is a paradox, a contradiction in terms. Reason is the only thing that can integrate and make compatible mutually exclusive ideas so that they're no longer mutually exclusive. So at any rate, the point being is that, getting back to my original point, the question of disprove, meaning prove there is not a God. What I think Christians are trying to say, I don't want to say theists are trying to say, is that you need to prove how your existential philosophy, your understanding of your essence, the infinite reference point of yourself, which creates the context for your reality, explain how that is a consistent and rational and a freely flowing ideology from start to finish without God, without compromising or truncating the premise or the conclusion. For example, without resorting to the aphorism, existence exists, which would be the existential, irreducible primary of Ayn Rand. Well, existence exists is a truncated, in my opinion, is a truncated metaphysical axiom. Meaning it's not an axiom. Existence may not necessarily exist. In order for your objectivism and in order for your philosophy to be consistent, the premise has to start there. But as soon as somebody denies the premise that, well, existence does not necessarily exist, because who gets to decide what existence is? Who gets to decide how to define the existence of an object and what that means? And where does the ability to conceptualize the self as existing come from? The ability must precede the actual concept of existence, and so where does that ability come from? So, when you truncate the premise, you're going to truncate the conclusion. You're never going to be able to bring the philosophy to its logical conclusion if the premise is not fully parsed out. So when they're asking atheists, prove there's not a God, I think what's really being asked is, explain to me how the metaphysical primary you hold, the infinite existence of self as the metaphysical primary from which everything proceeds, and therefore observation and empiricism is completely valid and relevant, and therefore we don't need God. Explain how you arrive there. Explain how you get to that existential, metaphysical axiom, that irreducible primary. Explain how you get there without God, without something or someone to mitigate the infinity of that irreducible, existential, metaphysical primary of self. Self is infinite. How is the self able to make the distinction between what it is and what it is not? That is a legitimate question, and a question that I think atheists need to answer before they can be taken like their theist counterparts, and they do the same thing. The theists have an irrational definition of God, which makes their existential primary, God's creation out of nothing, irrational. But the atheists are on the hook for the same thing. How does your metaphysical primary get a pass on reason, or get a pass on, why are we obliged to assume the validity and the rationality of your assumption without a rational argument beyond empiricism? And Christians or religious people or theists are somehow fools for theirs. So, again, to sort of wrap this up, I know I've been going on a while and droning on a little bit here, but again, to wrap this up, what's really being asked is explain how you arrive at an existential, irreducible primary of self without God. How do you know that you rightly observe self as distinct from another self? How do you arrive at the assumption that your existence is the root end, root beginning of all reality, which of course would not require God. If it's just a given that you are and that your existence is, because it's empirically observable, you wouldn't need God for that. But of course, someone who's a non-empiricist like myself would say, well, your ability to observe yourself and your ability to conceptualize yourself, to say that your existence exists, that follows existence. The ability to conceptualize, the conceptualization of self, not necessarily the ability, the conceptualization of self, the quantification of your surroundings, the idea that observation is empiric, observation is efficacious, is something that follows the root irreducible existential primary. So you can't logically, I'm sorry, but you can't logically look at what follows your existential primary and use that as proof that the existential primary is in fact infinitely axiomatic and self-evident. You would have to have an argument which precedes the development of the self as the root primary. You'd have to explain how that gets there by not referring to ideas like science and evidence and mathematics and quantifications and conceptualizations and abstractions, which proceed from that place of existence as the proof of it. That's totally irrational. That's a circular argument. That's the snake eating its tail. That's a circular non-argument, and it really undermines the atheist's entire premise. So the entire argument. So the next time somebody says, "Well, you can't prove there isn't a God," you can dismiss that on an ostensible level for being an irrational statement. You can't prove what isn't there, obviously. And you can dismiss it by saying, well, you don't need a definition of God because he really is irrelevant to your existential philosophy. But I hope you'll think a little bit harder about what's being said. Maybe read between the stupid vehicle or the irrational presentation of the question, and maybe look for. Maybe use a little bit of deductive reasoning to look at what's really being asked. I think, in their way, in their exasperated way, is how exactly do you arrive at your existential primary without God? How exactly is your philosophy consistent from beginning to end with literally no presumptions, no paradox, without the incorporation of something which mitigates the infinity of yourself, and hopefully that will help strengthen your argument. I challenge you to do this. I don't think you'll be able to do this. I think it's impossible. I think by definition the philosophy would need to be entirely dismantled, which would make atheism as a philosophy invalid. But if you do, and you do have you do find a consistent way and a rational way to somehow explain how the infinity of the human self, which then renders observation efficacious, is able to sort of come into its being without something to mitigate its infinity so that it can observe relative distinctions between itself and something else, then I would be happy to hear that. So, and thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your attention, and hopefully this furthers the discussion a little bit. Take care.